The laughter hits Amanda before she even reaches the sidewalk. 3 women from her stepmother's church circle stand outside the beauty supply store, their eyes fixed on the gray hoodie pulled low over her face. Amanda clutches her grocery bags tighter, her heart pounding as their cackles echo down the street. "Girl, ain't no man ever going to love you," one sneers. "Not with what's under that hood." Amanda's jaw tightens, but she keeps walking. She learned long ago that tears only make them laugh harder. That's when the convoy arrives. 3 black luxury SUVs roll to a stop, engines purring like sleeping predators. The block goes quiet because everyone knows who these cars belong to. The rear window of the middle vehicle slides down exactly 3 inches. From the darkness, a pair of sharp, calm eyes fix on Amanda. He watches her walk past without flinching, noting her quiet dignity despite the cruelty raining down on her. These eyes belong to Song-jin, the head of a powerful syndicate, and he does not look away. Amanda Daniel hadn't always lived as a ghost. There was a time she walked freely under the Atlanta sun, her face lifted to the warmth and a smile that could stop traffic. At 24, she had a beauty that made people pause. High cheekbones from her Nigerian father and the warm glow of her mother's skin. But that was before the fire, before the scars, and before her stepmother, Denise, took everything from her. The laughter hit Amanda before she even reached the sidewalk, a sharp, jagged sound that cut through the humid Atlanta air. "Look at her, still walking around like somebody's going to want that," a voice jeered. 3 women from her stepmother's church circle stood outside the beauty supply store, their eyes fixed like heat-seeking missiles on the light gray hood pulled low over Amanda's face. Amanda clutched her grocery bags tighter against her chest, the plastic handles digging into her palms as her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She kept her gaze pinned to the cracked pavement, trying to make herself small, trying to become the ghost Denise always reminded her she was. "Girl, ain't no man ever going to choose you," another woman added, her voice dripping with a cruel kind of pity. "Not with what's under that hood." Amanda's jaw tightened, the skin of her scarred cheek pulling uncomfortably, but she didn't stop. She had learned long ago that reacting only fed their hunger for drama. She walked with a quiet, guarded strength, her spine straight even as the poison of their words rained down on her. That was when the atmosphere of the street shifted. The petty cackles of the women were drowned out by a low, mechanical hum as a convoy of 3 black SUVs with deep-tinted windows rolled to a stop at the intersection. They sat there, engines purring like sleeping predators, exhaling an air of quiet authority that made the entire block go silent. Everyone in this neighborhood knew those cars. They knew the shadow of power they represented. As Amanda passed the middle vehicle, the rear window slid down exactly 3 inches. From the impenetrable darkness of the interior, a pair of sharp, observant eyes fixed on her. These were the eyes of Song-jin, a man who commanded empires in the shadows, yet in this moment, his focus was singular. Unlike the women on the sidewalk, he didn't look away in disgust, nor did he laugh. He watched her, really watched her, noting the way she carried her grocery bags like a shield and the dignity she maintained despite the ridicule. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to narrow down to the space between the car and the woman in the hoodie. Song-jin remained a silent, dominant presence, his arm resting casually on the door as he studied the girl the world had tried to erase. He saw the scars peeking from the edge of the fabric, but more importantly, he saw the woman who refused to break. As the light changed and the SUVs began to pull away, his gaze stayed anchored on her until she disappeared around the corner, leaving the echoes of the women's laughter sounding hollow and small in the wake of his silent, heavy stare. Amanda Daniel hadn't always lived in the cold grip of shadows. Before the gray hoodies and the heavy silence of the attic, there was a time when she walked freely under the Atlanta sun, her face lifted toward the warmth and her laughter ringing out like music. At 24, she had been the kind of beautiful that made people pause mid-conversation, possessed of a vibrant energy that seemed to light up every room she entered. She moved with an easy grace, her skin glowing with a warmth inherited from her mother and her eyes holding a spark that was equal parts softness and fire. Life back then revolved around the rhythmic clatter of her father's restaurant in the heart of Buckhead. Emmanuel Daniel was a hard-working man who had built a legacy out of spices and soul, and Amanda was his greatest pride. She remembered the smell of jollof rice and seasoned chicken wafting through the air, and the way her father would wink at her from behind the kitchen line. They were a team, a small but unbreakable unit forged in the wake of her mother's passing. Despite the grief of losing Neka when she was 17, Amanda had found a way to bloom again, buoyed by her father's steady love and the dreams they shared for the restaurant's future. During those golden years, she didn't know what it felt like to be invisible. She wore her hair in natural styles that framed her face, and she favored bright sundresses that matched her disposition. She spent her afternoons talking with regulars and her evenings planning community outreach programs, her heart full of the belief that she could change the world one plate at a time. There were no cruel cackles from church pews then, only the respectful nods of neighbors and the admiring glances of young men who hoped for a moment of her time. She had been a woman of substance and ambition, a Nigerian-American princess who knew exactly who she was. The sun had been her constant companion, a golden spotlight that celebrated her presence rather than a harsh glare she felt the need to hide from. Looking back, that version of Amanda felt like a character from a movie she had once seen. A girl who believed in the inherent kindness of the world and the permanence of her own joy. She hadn't yet learned that a single thunderstorm, a single grease trap, and the cold heart of a woman named Denise could turn the sun itself into a memory. The shift in Amanda's world didn't happen with a bang, but with a sweet, sticky coating of honey that eventually turned to vinegar. It started when Denise Harper walked into her father's life, trailing the scent of expensive perfume and an even more expensive smile. To a grieving widower like Emmanuel, Denise was a lifeline, a woman who seemed to offer the soft landing he needed after years of mourning his first wife. She was all grace and supportive nods, patting Amanda's hand and promising that they were going to be one big happy family. Amanda wanted to believe her, even if something in the way Denise eyed the restaurant's ledger felt a little too sharp to be purely matrimonial interest. The marriage was a whirlwind, and for a few months, the house felt full again. But the mask began to slip the moment the I-dose were exchanged. The honeyed words turned into subtle critiques, then into cold commands. Denise brought her own daughter, Brianna, into their home, and suddenly Amanda's space, both physical and emotional, began to shrink. Yet, through it all, Emmanuel remained the anchor. As long as he was there, the house was still a home. He was the barrier between Amanda and the growing frost of her stepmother's true nature. Then came the rainy Tuesday that shattered everything. It was a freak accident on I-85, a hydroplaning truck, a sudden swerve, and a collision that left no survivors. When the police knocked on the door to deliver the news, Amanda felt the ground beneath her feet vanish. Her father, her hero, the man who had built a kingdom out of kindness and hard work, was gone in an instant. The grief was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket that threatened to pull her under. But as Amanda stood in the foyer, trembling and broken, she looked up to see Denise. There were no tears in her stepmother's eyes. Instead, Denise stood tall, her gaze already sweeping over the mahogany furniture and the expensive paintings as if she were taking inventory. The warmth was gone, replaced by a terrifying, predatory stillness. In that moment, Amanda realized that the anchor had been cut, and she was now adrift in a house owned by a woman who had been waiting for the man she claimed to love to finally get out of her way. The tragedy was only the beginning. The real nightmare was just waking up. The insurance money was the prize Denise had been eyeing since the funeral, but the restaurant stood in her way, a stubborn monument to Emmanuel's legacy that he had left entirely to Amanda. For weeks after the accident, the atmosphere in the kitchen was thick with a new kind of tension. Denise began improving the property, bringing in her own contractors and making adjustments to the safety protocols that Amanda didn't understand. Amanda tried to focus on the work, finding solace in the familiar sizzle of the pans, unaware that the stage was being set for her destruction. The night of the fire was unnaturally still. Amanda was closing up alone, a task Denise had insisted she handle despite the late hour. She was in the back office, filing the day's receipts, when a strange, chemical odor began to drift through the vents. It wasn't the smell of overcooked food, it was sharp, acrid, and aggressive. Before she could even stand up, a muffled thump shook the building, followed by a roar that sounded like a living beast waking up in the walls. She rushed into the kitchen, only to be met by a wall of orange heat. The grease trap, which Denise's contractors had supposedly serviced just days before, had become a geyser of flame. The fire was spreading with an impossible speed, fueled by something that made the air heavy and black. Amanda scrambled for the fire extinguisher, but as she reached for it, a ceiling beam, weakened by the sudden inferno, cracked above her. She didn't have time to scream. The world became a chaotic blur of falling debris and searing pain. A heavy, burning light fixture swung down, the jagged metal catching her along the jaw and neck, pinning her momentarily against the prep table as the fire licked at her skin. The heat was an agonizing weight, a physical force trying to press the life out of her. Through the haze of smoke and the smell of her own burning flesh, she managed to roll toward the back exit, her vision flickering as the restaurant, her father's dream and her only home, crumbled into ash behind her. By the time the sirens wailed in the distance, Amanda was collapsed on the pavement, the cool night air feeling like needles against her raw, damaged face. In the chaos, she looked up to see Denise standing across the street, illuminated by the glow of the destruction. There was no panic on her stepmother's face, no rush to see if Amanda was alive. There was only a cold, satisfied calculation in her eyes. The restaurant was gone, the girl was broken, and the payout was finally within reach. That night, the fire didn't just take Amanda's beauty, it incinerated her future, leaving her to rise from the ashes not as a princess, but as a prisoner. In the 3 years that followed the fire, the sprawling manor that had once echoed with her father's laughter became Amanda's gilded cage. The insurance settlement had been massive, a windfall that Denise and Brianna spent with a feverish greed, filling the closets with designer labels and the driveway with luxury cars. But for Amanda, not a cent was spared for the skin grafts or the specialists the doctors had once recommended. Instead, she was relegated to the drafty attic room, a space that smelled of dust and forgotten memories, while the woman who had effectively orphaned her reigned downstairs. Her life became a repetitive cycle of invisible labor. She was the first one up in the gray light of dawn, scrubbing the marble floors until her knees ached and preparing elaborate meals she was rarely allowed to eat at the dining table. Denise had cleverly fired the professional cleaning staff shortly after their accident, informing the neighbors that Amanda was withdrawn and preferred to keep busy as a way of coping with her trauma. It was a lie that served two purposes. It saved Denise money and ensured that Amanda remained hidden from a world that might ask too many questions. On the rare occasions Amanda was permitted to leave the house for groceries or errands, she was forced to wear the heavy gray hoodie, a garment that became both her shield and her shroud. "You shouldn't want people to see you like that, Amanda," Denise would say, her voice a sharp blade wrapped in faux concern. "You'll only frighten them. Best to keep that face covered for everyone's sake." Even Brianna, once a mediocre student who lived in Amanda's shadow, took delight in the new hierarchy. She would intentionally spill red wine on the carpets just to watch Amanda scrub it out, or mock the way Amanda's voice had grown raspy and hesitant from disuse. To them, Amanda wasn't a sister or a stepdaughter, she was a ghost in the machine, a reminder of a man they wanted to forget and a crime they thought they'd gotten away with. Living as a phantom in her own home, Amanda felt her spirit begin to fray. She avoided mirrors, terrified of the jagged rope scars that marked the transition from her jaw to her neck, and she stopped looking people in the eye. She had become exactly what Denise wanted, a girl who believed her only value lay in the work of her hands and the silence of her tongue. She moved through the halls like a shadow, waiting for a life that felt as though it had ended the same night the restaurant burned to the ground. The heavy grocery bags felt like lead as Amanda took a shortcut through the narrow alleyway behind the local market. The sun was dipping low, casting long, skeletal shadows against the brick walls, and the evening chill began to seep through her hoodie. She usually avoided the backstreets, preferring the cruel but predictable gaze of the public to the unknown dangers of the dark. But today, the weight of her chores, and the weight of the church women's laughter, had left her exhausted, desperate to return to the relative safety of her attic room. Halfway through the passage, a metallic scent hit her, copper and salt. It was a smell she recognized from the night of the fire, the scent of life being spilled. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. In the dim light, she saw a figure slumped against a row of overflowing industrial bins. A man was half collapsed on the cold concrete, his tailored black suit jacket torn and darkened by a growing visceral wetness. Amanda's first instinct was to run. A girl like her, a ghost with no protection, had no business being near trouble. But then she heard it, a ragged, shallow breath that caught in the man's throat. It was the sound of someone struggling to hold onto the world, a sound her father had made in his final moments. Something inside her, a spark of the vibrant woman she used to be, overrode her fear. She dropped the grocery bags and knelt beside him. Up close, the man was striking, even in his diminished state. His black hair was slicked back, though a few stray strands were now matted with blood. Even as he drifted toward unconsciousness, his jaw remained set in a sharp, defiant line. He was the man from the SUV. As she reached out, her fingers trembling, his hand shot out with predatory speed, gripping her wrist. His eyes snapped open, sharp, dark, and searing with a dangerous intensity. But as he looked up, he didn't see a monster. He didn't see the scars that usually made people recoil. He saw the kindness in her steady brown eyes. "Don't," she whispered, her voice raspy but firm. "I'm here to help." He studied her for a heartbeat, his grip slowly loosening as his strength failed. His head rolled back against the brick, a low groan escaping his lips. Amanda didn't hesitate. She tore a clean kitchen towel from her grocery bag and pressed it firmly against the wound in his side. She knew what it was to be left in the dark to burn, and she refused to let it happen to him. In that shadow-drenched alley, the invisible girl and the fallen king found one another, tied together by a desperate silence and the sudden, urgent necessity of survival. In the days following the encounter in the alley, Amanda returned to her life as a ghost, convinced that the man in the tailored suit was merely a fever dream born of her own exhaustion. She scrubbed Denise's floors and polished Brianna's vanity, her hands moving mechanically while her mind remained anchored in the shadows of that brick passage. She expected the man to vanish back into the darkness of the city's underworld, but Sung-jin was not a man who left debts unpaid. It happened on a Tuesday, while Amanda was hanging laundry in the small, overgrown patch of yard behind the manor. The familiar hum of a high-end engine vibrated through the air, and 3 black SUVs pulled to the curb with clinical precision. Amanda's heart leaped into her throat, her first instinct to pull her hood lower, but she froze when the middle door opened. Sung-jin stepped out, no longer the bleeding predator she had found in the dirt. He was immaculate in a charcoal suit, his movements fluid and controlled, though a slight stiffness in his side betrayed the wound she had tended. He didn't wait for an invitation. He walked toward her, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made the surrounding world fall away. Denise appeared at the back door, her expression shifting from confusion to a calculated, greedy curiosity, but Sung-jin didn't spare her a glance. He stopped a respectful distance from Amanda, his gaze lingering on the edge of the scars that peeked from beneath her hoodie. "You saved my life," he said, his voice a deep, resonant silk. "In my world, that makes us bound." He didn't offer her money, which would have felt like an insult to the girl who had once owned a restaurant built on heart. Instead, he reached into his pocket and produced a small, ornate tin of rare loose-leaf tea and a book of classic poetry. "I am told you enjoy these," he noted, a ghost of a smile touching his sharp jawline. "I would like to hear you read from it. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere where you don't have to hide." To Denise's fury and Amanda's shock, he didn't ask for permission. He simply opened the door to his vehicle and waited. That afternoon, for the first time in 3 years, Amanda sat in a place of luxury not as a servant, but as a guest. They went to a secluded tea house on the edge of the city, a place of hushed voices and soft light. There, Sung-jin sat across from her, his presence a dominant but steadying force. He didn't flinch when her hood slipped back as she reached for her cup. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable but kind, listening as she found her voice again, one trembling line of poetry at a time. It was the beginning of a ritual, a series of tea dates where the world's most dangerous man and the world's most invisible girl began to weave a new story in the steam of a porcelain cup. As the weeks bled into a strange, rhythmic courtship, Amanda began to realize that S was more than just a man with a sharp suit and a taste for quiet tea houses. The weight of his name, Sung-jin, carried an invisible gravity that shifted the world around him. She noticed it first in the way the city seemed to pull back whenever his convoy appeared, a silent parting of the sea that had nothing to do with traffic laws and everything to do with a primal, collective fear. One afternoon, during their ritualized escape from the manor, they stopped at a high-end bookstore Amanda had once frequented with her father. As she stepped out of the SUV, she felt the usual impulse to tug her hoodie low, but Sung-jin was already there, his hand a steady, warm presence at the small of her back. The moment they crossed the threshold, the bustling shop fell into an eerie, respectful hush. The manager, a man who usually moved with a haughty indifference, scrambled toward them, his face pale and his hands trembling as he bowed low. "Mr. Sung-jin," the man stammered, his eyes darting to Amanda with a mixture of confusion and terror. We didn't expect you. Whatever you need, it is yours." Sung-jin didn't even acknowledge the man's frantic energy. He simply inclined his head, his calm, dominant presence filling the room. "The lady wishes to browse," he said, his voice a smooth, low command that left no room for debate. "Ensure she is not disturbed." Amanda watched in silent awe as the store was effectively cleared of other patrons. She saw the way the waitstaff at their usual cafe would serve them with downcast eyes, their movements precise and frantic, terrified of making a single mistake. She saw the way powerful men in tailored coats would freeze on the sidewalk if Sung-jin so much as glanced their way. It was a jarring contrast to her life at home, where Denise treated her like a stain on the carpet. Here, beside this man, she was treated like royalty simply by association. But it wasn't the fear he inspired that fascinated her, it was the way he used that power to create a sanctuary for her. In his world, people didn't stare at her scars because they were too afraid to look at him, and for the first time in 3 years, Amanda felt the heavy burden of public judgment lift. She was beginning to understand that Sung-jin didn't just have a name, he had a kingdom, and for some reason she couldn't yet fathom, he was inviting a ghost like her to sit beside him on the throne. The realization was as terrifying as it was intoxicating, a reminder that the man who looked at her with such gentleness was the same man the rest of the world feared to cross. The sun was beginning to set, painting the Atlanta skyline in bruised purples and burnt oranges, when Sung-jin led Amanda to a private rooftop terrace. Away from the prying eyes of the city and the suffocating walls of the manor, the air felt thinner, easier to breathe. They sat in a corner shadowed by lush greenery, the steam from their tea curling lazily into the twilight. Sung-jin watched her with that same unblinking intensity, but tonight, his silence wasn't a demand, it was an invitation. "You spend your days scrubbing floors for a woman who does not deserve your sweat," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to ground her. "But your eyes, they aren't the eyes of a servant. What do you see when you look at the future, Amanda?" Amanda hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her porcelain cup. For years, she had buried her desires so deep she wasn't sure they still had a pulse. But with Sung-jin, the shame that usually acted as a gag felt strangely absent. She took a breath, her voice raspy but gaining strength as she spoke. "My mother Neka. She used to say that scars are just the places where the light enters," Amanda whispered, finally lifting her gaze to meet his. "I don't want to just survive Denise. I want to build something. I want to start a foundation, the Neka Foundation. A place for people like me. Not just those with physical scars, but anyone the world has tried to make invisible. I want to give them back their names, their voices, and the resources to rebuild their lives when everything has burned down." As she spoke, the phantom weight of her gray hoodie seemed to vanish. She described the community center, the counseling rooms, and the vocational training she dreamed of providing. She spoke of her father's recipes and how she wanted to teach others that their past didn't have to define their worth. It was the first time she had said the words aloud, and the dream felt like a living thing between them. Sung-jin didn't interrupt. He listened with a profound, focused stillness, as if he were memorizing the blueprints of her heart. When she finished, a heavy silence settled over the terrace, but it wasn't the silence of judgment. "The Neka Foundation," he repeated slowly, the name sounding like a vow on his tongue. He reached across the table, his hand hovering just inches from hers, offering a connection she was finally brave enough to take. "A beautiful dream, Amanda. And in my world, we do not just dream. We build." In that moment, under the rising moon, Amanda realized that Sung-jin didn't just see her resilience, he saw her power. And for the first time since the fire, she began to believe that the girl in the attic was gone, replaced by a woman with a vision worth fighting for. The shift in the household's energy was instantaneous the morning a courier arrived at the manor, hand-delivering an envelope that felt far too heavy to contain a mere letter. It was made of thick, cream-colored cardstock, embossed with a gold seal that shimmered under the foyer's chandelier. Denise snatched it from the silver tray before Amanda could even process the delivery, her eyes widening as she took in the elegant calligraphy. It was an invitation to the Kwon Foundation Gala, the most exclusive event of the social season, a night where the city's true architects of power gathered behind closed doors. Finally, Denise breathed, her voice trembling with a cocktail of triumph and greed. Finally, they've recognized our standing. She turned the card over, her manicured thumb tracing the gold foil. It's addressed to the House of Daniel. That's us, Brianna. This is the moment we've been waiting for. Once we're in that room, the insurance money won't just be a safety net, it'll be our ticket into the elite. Amanda stood in the shadows of the hallway, a damp cleaning rag still in her hand, watching her stepmother and stepsister descend into a frenzy of vanity. They immediately began debating designers and jewelers, their voices rising in a shrill duet of self-importance. To them, the invitation was a trophy, a validation of the stolen life they had built on the ashes of her father's hard work. They didn't notice the way Amanda's heart skipped a beat at the mention of the Kwon name. She knew that name, she had seen it on the side of the buildings Sung-jin owned, and she had heard the hushed, reverent tones of his associates. And don't you even think about showing your face that night, Denise snapped, momentarily breaking away from her celebration to cast a look of pure vitriol toward Amanda. You'll be staying in the attic where you belong. We can't have the guests seeing what you've become. It would be an embarrassment to your father's memory. The irony of Denise mentioning her father's memory nearly made Amanda speak out, but she held her tongue, the weight of the secret she shared with Sung-jin acting as a silent anchor. As Denise and Brianna rushed out to begin their high-end shopping spree, Amanda returned to the foyer to pick up a small, unnoticed scrap of paper that had fallen from the envelope. It wasn't part of the formal invitation. It was a handwritten note, the ink dark and the script precise, containing only 3 words, "Wear the blue." A shiver that had nothing to do with the drafty house raced down Amanda's spine. The gala wasn't just a party, it was a summons. And for the first time in 3 years, the girl in the attic realized she wasn't being invited to watch from the sidelines. She was being called to the front lines of a war Denise didn't even know had begun. The house was a whirlwind of silk, hairspray, and vanity as the night of the gala arrived. From her vantage point at the top of the servants' stairs, Amanda watched as Denise and Brianna prepared for their grand debut. Denise was draped in a crimson gown that cost more than a year of the restaurant's old payroll, her neck weighted down by a diamond necklace bought with insurance money that didn't belong to her. They looked like the epitome of high society, but to Amanda, they looked like thieves dressed in stolen finery. "Remember, Amanda," Denise called out, checking her reflection one last time with a smirk of pure satisfaction. "If you so much as set a foot downstairs tonight, I'll make sure you're out on the street by morning. Stay in your hole." The heavy front door clicked shut, and the house fell into an unnatural, heavy silence. For a moment, Amanda stood still, the echoes of Denise's threats ringing in her ears. But then, she felt the small slip of paper in her pocket, the note that had arrived with the invitation. "Wear the blue." She retreated to her attic room and reached into the very back of her meager closet. Hidden behind a row of oversized hoodies was a garment bag she hadn't touched in 3 years. Inside was a navy blue silk gown, the last gift her father had given her for her 24th birthday, a gala he had planned to take her to before the fire took his life and her confidence. As she pulled the dress out, the fabric felt like water against her skin. It was high-necked, designed with an elegant modesty that now felt like a providential shield. She slipped into it, the silk molding to her frame, reminding her of the woman she used to be. She didn't have diamonds or professional stylists, but she had the steady pulse of her own quiet rebellion. She spent an hour on her hair, pulling it back into a sleek, sophisticated updo that emphasized her regal Nigerian features. She didn't try to hide the scars with heavy makeup. Instead, she chose a deep berry lipstick that made her brown skin glow. Finally, she reached for the gray hoodie one last time, not as a shroud, but as a cloak. She would wear it over the gown until she reached the venue, a secret armor for her journey through the night. As she stepped out of the manor and into the waiting car Sung-jin had sent to the end of the block, Amanda didn't feel like a ghost anymore. She felt like a storm gathering strength. Denise had told her she was an embarrassment, but tonight, Amanda was going to show the world that the House of Daniel still had a rightful heir. The invisible girl was gone, the woman in navy blue was ready to reclaim her name. The ballroom of the St. Regis was a sea of crystal chandeliers, sparkling champagne, and the suffocating scent of old money. Amanda stood at the edge of the mezzanine, her heart thundering against her ribs. She had shed the gray hoodie in the car, and now the navy silk of her father's gift felt like both a second skin and a target. Below her, The elite of Atlanta mingled, oblivious to the ghost watching from the shadows. She spotted them almost immediately. Denise and Brianna were holding court near the center of the room, preening under the attention of a group of local socialites. Denise was mid-laugh, her hand resting on the diamond necklace that had been bought with the blood of Amanda's legacy, when her gaze drifted upward. The laughter died instantly. Denise's face morphed from polished elegance to a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She whispered something sharply to Brianna, and the two women began to weave through the crowd like snakes toward the stairs. Amanda didn't run. She stood her ground as they reached the mezzanine, the air around them turning frigid. "How dare you," Denise hissed, her voice a low, lethal vibration. "I told you to stay in your hole. You look like a grotesque parody of your mother. Do you have any idea what you've done? You are a stain on this evening, a reminder of a tragedy everyone here is trying to forget." Brianna sneered, stepping closer to inspect the scars along Amanda's jawline. "Look at her skin. No amount of silk can hide that. You're an embarrassment, Amanda. Guards. Someone get this." "The only embarrassment in this room," a deep, resonant voice interrupted, "is the lack of hospitality shown to my guest." The crowd parted as if sliced by a blade. Song-Jin approached, his presence so dominant that the ambient noise of the gala seemed to mute into a dull hum. He was immaculate in a tailored tuxedo, his eyes dark and dangerous as they locked onto Denise. He didn't look at Amanda with pity, he looked at her with a terrifyingly calm possessiveness. Denise blanched, her bravado evaporating. "Mr. Song-Jin. I didn't realize she was with you. She's just a troubled girl we've been caring for, She is the reason this gala is happening," Song-Jin said, his voice carrying to the onlookers who had begun to gather. He stepped past Denise as if she were made of glass, stopping only when he was inches from Amanda. He offered his arm, his sharp jaw set in a line of quiet authority. "And if you ever speak to her in that tone again, you will find out exactly how small your world can become." The silence in the room was absolute. Amanda looked at Song-Jin, then back at the woman who had spent 3 years trying to bury her. For the first time, Denise looked small. For the first time, the world was watching, and they weren't looking at the scars. They were looking at the man who had chosen the woman everyone said would never be loved. The music shifted, a slow, swelling orchestral arrangement that seemed to pull the oxygen out of the room. Song-Jin didn't wait for the gossip to settle or for Denise to recover her breath. He simply led Amanda toward the center of the polished marble dance floor. The elite of the city drew back, forming a wide, hushed circle of silk and tuxedos, their eyes burning with a mix of judgment and morbid curiosity. Amanda felt the weight of those hundreds of stares, a familiar heat that usually made her want to vanish. But the hand on her waist was steady, a solid, unyielding anchor. Song-Jin stopped in the very center of the spotlight, turning her to face him. "They are waiting for you to hide, Amanda," he whispered, his voice for her ears alone. "They expect the shadow. Show them the light instead." With a trembling hand, Amanda reached up. For 3 years, the fabric of her hoods had been her sanctuary and her shroud. It had been the wall between her soul and the cruelty of the world. Her fingers brushed the edge of the navy silk wrap she had used to cover her hair and jaw for the entrance. She felt Denise's panicked gaze from the sidelines, a silent plea for her to remain invisible. Amanda took a breath, and in one fluid motion, she let the fabric fall. The silk slid down her shoulders, pooling on the floor like spent ink. For the first time in public, the light of 1,000 crystals hit the jagged ropey scars that traced the line of her jaw and traveled down the elegant curve of her neck. A collective, sharp intake of breath hissed through the ballroom. Someone gasped, someone else turned away. But Song-Jin didn't flinch. He didn't look at the scars with the clinical pity of a doctor or the revulsion of a stranger. He looked at her as if she were the only beautiful thing in a room full of glass. He stepped closer, closing the distance until their hearts beat in a shared rhythm, and placed his hand gently, deliberately, right over the scarred skin of her neck. His touch was warm, a silent claim that turned her marks of trauma into medals of honor. "You are breathtaking," he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach the front row of the stunned crowd. As he swept her into the first turns of the waltz, Amanda realized the world hadn't ended. The laughter had stopped. The mockery had died. In the arms of the most feared man in the city, the girl who had been told no man would ever love her was dancing in the light, her face uncovered, her spirit finally taking flight above the ruins of her past. She wasn't just surviving the gaze of the syndicate, she was commanding it. The music had barely faded when the real orchestration began. As Amanda stood tall in the center of the ballroom, the whispers of the elite were silenced by a new arrival, a team of men in dark suits who carried not champagne, but folders of heavy, damning evidence. Seung-jin did not resort to the violence of his world to settle this debt. He knew that for a woman like Denise, the true death was the loss of her reputation and her wealth. "You've enjoyed the house of Daniel long enough," Seung-jin said, his voice cold and echoing through the hushed hall. He signaled to one of the men, who stepped forward to present Denise with a stack of documents. "The grease trap in the restaurant didn't fail due to neglect, Denise. It was tampered with. We found the contractor you hired, and paid in cash, to ensure that the insurance claim would be undisputed." Denise's face turned a sickly shade of gray, the crimson of her gown now clashing with the terror in her eyes. "This is a lie," she stammered, looking around for an ally, but the socialites she had been courting just moments ago were already backing away, their faces twisted in disgust. "You have no proof." "I have the bank records of the offshore account you opened 2 weeks after Emmanuel's death," Seung-jin countered, stepping forward with a predatory grace. "And I have the original will your husband signed before the accident on the highway, the one that leaves the entirety of the estate, the house, and the remaining insurance funds to his only daughter, Amanda." The crowd gasped as officers of the court moved in. Amanda watched, her hand still trembling in Seung-jin's, as the diamonds were practically stripped from Denise's neck by the weight of her own crimes. The woman who had made Amanda a ghost for 3 years was now the one being erased. Denise tried to scream, to lash out, but she was led away in a flurry of camera flashes and hushed condemnation, Brianna trailing behind her in a state of shattered shock. As the doors closed behind them, the heavy darkness that had hung over Amanda's life for 3 years finally lifted. The light of the ballroom felt different now, no longer a spotlight of judgment, but a dawn of justice. Seung-jin turned to her, his expression softening as the coldness of the syndicate boss faded. "It's over, Amanda," he whispered. "The house is yours. The legacy is yours. And you will never have to hide again." Justice had been served not with a blade, but with the cold, hard truth. The girl from the attic was gone, and in her place stood the rightful heir to the Daniel name, backed by the man who had seen her worth when the rest of the world chose to look away. The transition from the shadow of the attic to the brilliance of the sun-drenched garden happened gradually, then all at once. Months later, the manor that had once been a prison stood transformed. The heavy curtains were gone, replaced by open windows that invited the Atlanta breeze to sweep through the halls. The bronze plaque near the entrance now bore the name the world would come to know, the Necker Foundation. It was no longer a house of secrets, but a sanctuary where the invisible found their voices and the scarred found their strength. On the day of the opening, Amanda stood on the sprawling back lawn, the very place she had once hung laundry in a heavy gray hoodie. Now, she wore a sleeveless gown of ivory lace that swept the grass, her shoulders bare and her head held high. The scars along her jaw were visible, catching the afternoon light, but they no longer looked like marks of tragedy. To the women she had invited, those who had spent their lives hiding as she once had, those scars looked like a map of survival. Beside her stood Seung-jin, his presence as dominant as ever, yet his eyes held a softness reserved only for the woman at his side. He had traded the cold clinicality of the syndicate for the quiet pride of a man watching his greatest investment bloom. He hadn't just given her back her father's wealth, he had given her the space to remember that she was the architect of her own destiny. The foundation's opening flowed seamlessly into an intimate garden wedding. There were no prying cameras or judgmental church circles. Instead, under the ancient oaks, Amanda and Seung-jin exchanged vows that spoke of resilience and a love that saw beyond the surface. As the orchestra began to play a familiar waltz, Seung-jin led her to the center of the grass. "Do you regret it?" Amanda asked softly, leaning into him as they swayed. "Choosing the woman everyone said no man would ever love?" Seung-jin pulled back just enough to look at her, his hand gently tracing the line of her jaw. "I regret nothing," he whispered, "except that I didn't find you sooner." Amanda smiled, the kind of smile that didn't just light up her face, but the lives of everyone who looked at her. She realized then that the world hadn't changed. The people who mocked her might still be out there, but she had. She was no longer a ghost or a victim. She was Amanda Daniel, a woman who had walked through fire and come out not just whole but powerful. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the Necker Foundation, she knew her story wasn't just about being chosen by a king, it was about finally choosing herself. Your worth is never defined by your surface, but by the strength of the spirit beneath it. Amanda was told by society and those closest to her that her scars made her unlovable and invisible. However, her true beauty lay in her resilience, her kindness in the face of cruelty, and her refusal to let trauma extinguish her light. The story teaches us that the right people, those with true vision, will see your value not in spite of your scars, but because of the powerful person you became while wearing them. It reminds us that no matter how deep the fire burns, you have the power to rise from the ashes and reclaim your name. If Amanda's journey from the shadows to the light touched your heart today, remember, your story isn't over, and your scars are just proof that you are a survivor. Don't let the world tell you who you are. If you want to see more powerful stories of redemption, justice, and the kind of love that defies the odds, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now. Tap the notification bell so you never miss a moment of these captivating tales. Join our community of dreamers and survivors. We have so many more stories to tell, and we want you here for every single one of them. Subscribe now for more.